The first thing Nora Voss heard when she stepped off the wagon was silence. Not the soft kind. Not the peaceful kind that settles over a parlor on a Sunday afternoon when the fire is low and the tea has gone cold.
Thank you.
This was a different silence entirely. This was the kind that swallowed sound whole.
It truly is. I could ride here forever.
Pressed against the ears like a held breath.
Yes, let's.
That warned you, clearly, and without apology,
I'm glad you like
that if you disappeared up here, no one would hear you call. The wagon driver did not look at her when he handed down her carpet bag.
It's beautiful.
He kept his eyes on the tree line, on the pale ribbon of trail that wound upward through the pines and disappeared into shadow.
We must be certain.
Far as I go, he said. Nora looked up the mountain. Through the trees, maybe half a mile above,
this one is ready.
She could just make out the dark shape of a rooftop against the gray September sky. How long is the walk? 40 minutes if the trail holds, hour if it doesn't. He clicked his tongue at the horses. Good luck to you, ma'am. He did not mean it. She could tell by the way he said it, flat and final, like a door being closed from the other side. She watched the wagon turn and roll back down the dirt road until the sound of the wheels faded into the trees. Then there was nothing left but the wind moving through the pines and the distant call of a crow somewhere above her. Nora picked up her carpet bag, settled the strap over her shoulder, and began to climb. She had left Philadelphia on a Tuesday in late August, carrying $43, a change of clothes, a small tin of dried chamomile her mother had pressed into her hands a decade ago and which Nora had never opened, and a piece of paper folded into quarters inside her coat pocket. The paper had a name on it, Cormac Holt, a ranch outside Greystone, Colorado. 200 acres of mountain land with a creek running through the south pasture. She had read the advertisement 4 times before she answered it. Not because she was uncertain, because she wanted to be sure she understood exactly what she was agreeing to. The agency had been straightforward in the way that only people who deal in desperate circumstances can be. There was a man in Colorado. He needed help. He was willing to provide a home and a name in exchange for a wife who could cook, keep house, and manage the work of a working ranch. There were no promises of affection mentioned in the letter, no mention of warmth or companionship, just the practical language of a transaction between 2 people who had each run out of other options. Nora had folded the paper back into its 4 creases and written her reply that same evening. She was not naive about what she was walking toward. She had been married before. She knew what it was to live with a man who saw her as part of the furniture, useful when functional and ignored when not. Edmund Voss had been charming in the way that certain men are charming, the kind of charm that is performance rather than character, that shines brightest in public and goes entirely dark behind closed doors. He had died of a fever the previous November, leaving behind a collection of gambling debts that his creditors had been remarkably efficient about presenting to his widow. The house was gone by December. Her brother-in-law's spare room lasted 3 weeks before his wife made clear, in the language of sighs and silences that women use when they want to wound without evidence, that the arrangement was not working out. 2 cousins declined. A former employer offered condolences and nothing else. By January, Nora had understood something that women in her position eventually understand. There is a point past which grief and dignity and patience stop being useful tools. Past that point, there is only the choice in front of you and the question of whether you are willing to make it. She was willing. She had answered the advertisement on a Wednesday evening in March, sitting at a rented table in a rented room, with the last of her candles burning down and the sound of someone else's children moving through the walls. The room itself told the story of where she had arrived, a window that looked onto a brick wall, a basin with a crack along one side that she had learned to fill carefully to avoid the drip, a hook behind the door where her one good coat hung in a space too small for it to hang straight. She had looked at these things and understood that they were the final argument, not despair, just clarity. She had written the letter in plain language, the same way she did everything. She listed what she could do and what she could not. She did not embellish. She did not beg. She folded the letter, sealed it, and set it by the door to post in the morning. She had thought, sitting there with the candle burning down, that another woman might have wept over such a letter, might have felt the weight of what it represented, the narrowing of possibility, the closing of the life she had imagined. But Nora had found, in the months since Edmund's death, that she did not weep over the things she had lost. She wept over the things she had not known she wanted until they were already gone. Those griefs were different, and they came at unexpected times. Not at the lawyer's office, not when the house was emptied, but once in the spring, when she walked past a seed merchant's window and saw the packets of herbs arranged in rows, and thought, without meaning to, that she did not have a windowsill anymore. She had slept better that night than she had in months. The trail held. It was steep, and the carpet bag was heavier than it had any right to be. And by the time Nora cleared the tree line, her legs were trembling, and the back of her dress was damp with sweat, despite the cold. She stopped at the edge of the pines and looked out. The ranch sat in a shallow bowl of land just below the ridge, surrounded on 3 sides by mountain, and on the 4th by a long slope of open meadow that ran down toward a creek she could hear but not see. There was a cabin, square and dark, built from the mountain's own timber, a barn, a fence line running in both directions, one section visibly mended, one section visibly not. A kitchen garden behind the cabin, or what had been one once, now mostly gone to weeds. Everything worked, nothing lived. That was the impression it gave, standing there in the thin mountain air with the wind pushing against her back. It was a place that functioned, that fed and sheltered and persisted. But there was no warmth in the geometry of it, no softness in the way the buildings sat on the land, no evidence that anyone who lived here had ever looked up from the work long enough to notice the view. A man stood on the porch. He did not wave. He did not move. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched her come across the yard the way a man watches weather moving in from the west, without welcome and without alarm, simply noting the fact of it. Nora did not slow her pace. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and set her carpet bag down. He was taller than she had expected, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from long practice at containing something that does not sit still naturally. His face was weathered in the way that outdoor work weathers a face, lined around the eyes and the mouth, burned dark by the sun. His hair was dark going to gray at the temples. He looked like a man who had been 40 for a long time. He looked at her the way you look at something you are not sure what to do with. Then he stepped down 1 step from the porch and held out a burlap sack. 1 week's provisions, he said. His voice was flat, not cruel, just flat, the way stone pulled from cold water is flat, without give or warmth. If you're smart, you'll use it to leave. Nora looked at the sack. Then she looked at his hands. His nails were clean. She reached out and took the sack. He turned and walked back into the cabin, left the door open behind him. Nora picked up her carpet bag. She walked up the steps. She walked through the open door. The cabin was one room, a table with 2 chairs, one of them broken at the back leg so that it leaned at an angle that would not hold a person's weight. A rope bed against the far wall with a single wool blanket folded at the foot of it. A potbelly stove in the corner, cold and full of old ash. No curtains on the windows, no rug on the floor, no photographs, no decoration, no evidence of anything that had not been chosen for strictly practical purposes. Cormac Holt had seated himself at the table with a cup of water and was looking at nothing in particular. He did not acknowledge her entrance. Nora set her carpet bag down beside the door. She looked around the room once, taking inventory the way she had learned to take inventory of any new situation, quickly and without sentimentality. Then she crossed to the stove, opened the ash door, found the coal scuttle half full beside it. She cleaned out the old ash. She found the wood box near the back wall and built a fire. She found the salt pork and cornmeal in the sack he had given her, and she cooked. She set 2 plates on the table. Cormac Holt stood up, took his plate, and moved to the window. He stood there and ate, looking out at the darkening yard. She sat down and ate at the table alone. The food was plain, but it was hot, and the fire was beginning to take, and the smell of warm cornmeal had replaced the smell of cold ash that had been the first thing she noticed when she came through the door. These were small improvements. She was in the business of small improvements. When she had finished and cleared the plates, she tried once to speak. "How long have you been on this land?" she asked. He walked out before she finished the sentence, not in anger, simply in the way a man exits a room when he has decided he is done with it. The door did not slam. It closed the way it always closed, with a familiar click that told her it had been closed that way 10,000 times before. She sat at the table for a while after he left. Outside, the mountain wind moved against the cabin walls, and the fire snapped in the stove, and somewhere far off, a coyote called out once and went quiet. Nora did not allow herself to feel what she might have felt if she had given it permission. She was practiced at that by now, at the discipline of setting things aside until they could be looked at in better light. She made a bed from what was there. She lay down on the rope frame and pulled the wool blanket over her and looked up at the ceiling in the dark. Through the window, she could see the barn. A lantern burned in the doorway of it, yellow and steady against the dark. The shadow of a man stood in the opening, not moving, facing out toward the black meadow below. He was not doing anything, not working, not smoking, not looking at anything in particular that she could see, just standing there at the edge of the light, looking into the dark. He stood there for a long time. Nora watched him until her eyes grew heavy. She did not know what kind of man stood in a barn doorway at midnight, watching nothing. She did not know what he was keeping watch over, or what he was keeping at bay, or whether there was any difference between the two. But she did not leave. That was the first choice she made on the mountain. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that announces itself. Just the quiet decision to close her eyes and let the morning come. In the morning, she found the garden, or what was left of one. It ran along the back of the cabin in a long rectangle bordered by stones someone had carried up from the creek, smooth gray river stones set carefully into the earth so that they would not shift. The care with which those stones had been placed was visible still, even through the 3 years of neglect that had overtaken everything inside the border. The weeds had taken it thoroughly. Thistle and wild mountain grass and something with a low runner that had spread itself across the entire bed in a dense mat. But beneath it, Nora could see the shapes of what had been planted there deliberately. The mounded form of herbs in rows. The woody stalks of something that had once been full and fragrant and was now dry and brittle, reduced to structure without life. She knelt at the edge of the bed and pushed the weeds aside with both hands. The smell of disturbed earth rose up around her. She found sage first, its silver leaves still faintly present under the dead growth. Thyme. And then, at the far end of the row, lavender. Stems gone to wood, but the shape of it still recognizable, still holding the memory of what it had been. Someone had planted these with knowledge and intention. Someone who understood what each plant needed and what each was for. Someone who had cared about this soil. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the whole length of the bed. She thought, 3 years. Then she began to pull weeds. The thorns bit into her palms almost immediately. The wild grass came up in long runners that resisted and then gave suddenly, so that her hands slipped and she caught herself on the stones. The thistle required gloves she did not have. The ground was hard, compacted by weather and time, and each root fought the way roots do when they have had long enough to make themselves permanent. She kept pulling. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of the axe, steady and rhythmic from the far side of the cabin, wood splitting cleanly in the cold morning air. She did not look up. She worked. He worked. No words passed between them. Just the sound of her pulling things from the earth and his axe striking wood, over and over, the mountain morning moving around them both. After an hour, something appeared at the edge of her vision. She looked up. A wooden bucket, set beside her in the dirt without ceremony, full of cold water from the creek. She looked toward the sound of the axe. Cormac Holt was already walking away, back to the splitting block, back to his work. He had not looked at her face. He did not look back. Nora picked up the bucket and drank from it in long swallows, the water cold enough to ache in her teeth. Then she set it down and went back to the weeds. She found it just before noon. Her hands were deep in the corner of the bed where the soil was darkest, working around a root that had wound itself through everything, and her fingers closed around something that was not a root and not a rock. She pulled it free carefully. It was a doll, small enough to fit in one cupped hand. Cloth. The fabric faded to a pale gray that might once have been blue or green or something brighter entirely. Stuffed with corn husks that had gone soft with time. One button eye still attached, dark brown, sewn with small careful stitches. The other eye gone, just a loop of thread remaining, waiting for something that was not coming back. Nora held it in her palm and looked at it for a long time. She carried it to the well and rinsed it with clean water, gently, the way you handle a thing that has been through something. She pressed the water out of the corn husk stuffing without wringing it. She smoothed the faded cloth. She set it on the inner ledge of the kitchen window where the afternoon light would come through and dry it slowly. Then she went back to the garden. She did not know whose it was. She did not need to know yet. But the clean nails, the careful stones around the garden border, the herbs planted in proper rows by someone who understood them, the lantern burning in the barn doorway in the middle of the night. The picture was assembling itself without her having to force it. She worked until the light began to change and the cold came back into the air with the authority it carried at this altitude, final and non-negotiable. She straightened up and pressed her hands against the small of her back. The bed was not cleared. It would take another day, maybe 2. But the shape of it was visible now, the original intention of it, the rows and the borders and the care that had gone into it 3 years ago. It could come back. She was thinking about that, about what it would need and how long it would take and what she would plan in the sections that were too far gone to recover when she heard him behind her. She turned. Cormac Holt stood 10 feet away at the corner of the cabin. He was not looking at the garden. He was looking at the window, at the doll on the ledge, drying in the last of the afternoon light. He stood very still. Something moved through his face, fast and controlled, the way something moves through water before it goes still again. His jaw tightened. His eyes did not change exactly, but the quality of them did. The way the quality of a room changes when a door is opened onto something you were not expecting. He looked at the doll for what might have been 10 seconds, or might have been longer. Then he turned and walked toward the tree line at the back of the property and did not stop walking. She watched him go until the pines took him. He did not come back until after dark. She had made dinner and eaten alone and banked the fire and was sitting at the table with her hands folded when she heard his boots on the porch. He came in without looking at her. He did not eat. He sat in the good chair against the far wall and was quiet for a long time. The lamp burned between them. The fire crackled low. Outside, the mountain turned its cold and patient face toward the stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful in the way that voices are careful when the words have to come from a long distance. "Garden's been dead 3 years," he said. "Won't come back." Nora looked at her hands, at the soil still caught under her fingernails despite the washing, at the small cuts on her palms from the thistle. "We'll see," she said quietly. He said nothing else. After a while, he moved to his bedroll in the corner, the one she had noticed folded against the wall that first morning, the one that told her he had given the rope bed without being asked or thanked for it. The lamp burned low. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like something trying to speak in a language that no longer had words for what it needed to say. Nora sat at the table until the fire settled into coals. Then she lay down on the rope bed and pulled the blanket over her shoulders and looked at the ceiling in the dark. She thought about the garden, about the stones set so carefully along the border, about a pair of hands that had pressed seeds into this soil with the kind of attention that means something more than habit. She thought about the doll with one eye missing. She thought, whoever planted those herbs knew what they were for. She thought, so do I. She closed her eyes. Outside, the mountain held its cold, and its silence, and its long, dark patience. And inside the cabin, 2 people lay in the same room without speaking, each one carrying something the other could not yet see, each one further from the door than they had been the day before. On the 8th morning, the sack was empty. Nora had known it was coming. She had rationed carefully, the way a woman who has lived through lean months learns to ration, stretching what was there without drawing attention to the stretching. The salt pork had lasted 6 days. The cornmeal had gone to 7. The last of the flour she had used the previous evening for a flat bread that was more crust than crumb, but was warm and filled the cabin with the smell of something made rather than just heated. She set the empty sack on the table where Cormac would see it when he came in from the barn. He came in at first light, the way he always came in, without announcement, boots loud on the porch boards, and then quiet on the cabin floor. He looked at the sack. He looked at her. He did not say anything, but she understood the shape of what he was waiting for. He was waiting for her to pack her carpet bag. He was waiting for the leaving that 4 women before her had all eventually chosen, some after 3 days, one after 5, and one she had gathered from a fragment of conversation in Greystone after exactly 7. She was on the 8th. Nora put on her coat. She took the money she had kept folded inside the lining, $31 remaining after the train and the wagon and the small expenses of getting herself from Philadelphia to the base of this mountain. She counted what she would need. She put the rest back. "I'll be back before dark," she said. He said nothing. She walked out. The trail down to Greystone took 40 minutes at a working pace, and she covered it without stopping, the cold morning air sharp in her lungs, and the frost still on the grass in the shadowed sections where the sun had not yet reached. The mountain was different going down than going up. Going up, you could not see where you were headed. Going down, you could see everything, the whole long reach of the valley below, the gray thread of the main road, the cluster of buildings that made up Greystone sitting at the base of the range, like something left behind by a larger, more ambitious town. The general store was already open. A bell above the door announced her arrival to a man behind the counter who looked at her the way people in small towns look at someone they do not yet have a category for. "Help you?" he said. "Flour," Nora said. "Lard, sugar, salt pork if you have it, dried beans, and seed packets, whatever you carry that does well in mountain soil." He began pulling things from the shelves. He was a compact man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the cautious eyes of someone who had seen a certain kind of situation before and had formed opinions about it. His name, she would learn later, was Silas Webb. "You up at the Holt place?" he asked. "Yes." He set a bag of flour on the counter and looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to say the thing he is thinking. "How long you been up there?" 8 days. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Longer than most." He reached for the lard. "Women always think they'll be different." Nora watched him set the items on the counter one by one. She did not look away from his face when she answered. "I am," she said. He glanced up. She held his gaze without challenge and without apology, the way she held most things she meant. He looked back down at the counter and finished filling the order without further comment. She spent $22.30. She lifted the sack herself when he made no move to carry it. It was heavier than she had anticipated. Not unmanageable, but present. The kind of weight that announces itself with every step and does not let you forget it is there. She settled the strap over her shoulder, adjusted the balance, and walked back out into the morning. The trail up took longer than 40 minutes with the sack. She stopped twice, not to rest exactly, but to shift the weight from one shoulder to the other and to breathe through the steeper sections where the trail switched back on itself and the loose shale wanted to slide under her boots. The sun had fully cleared the ridge by the time she came through the tree line and the cabin came into view below the peak. Cormac Holt was standing on the porch. He was not doing anything, not working, not carrying anything, not in the middle of a task that had happened to position him there. He was standing on the porch in the mid-morning with his arms at his sides, looking down the trail, looking toward her. Nora did not slow her pace. She crossed the yard and came up the porch steps and set the sack down on the boards beside him with the care of someone setting down something that had cost them something. He looked at the sack. He looked at her. He did not help her carry it in, but he did not turn away either. He stood on the porch and watched her pick it up again and take it through the door, and when she came back out for the seed packet she had tucked into her coat pocket, he was still standing there, and his face had changed in some small way she could not quite name. Not softer, not warmer, but different. Like a question that had just become a different question. That afternoon, she planted the first seeds. The garden was still not fully cleared. There was another half day of work in the far corner where the runner weed had gone deep. But the center of the bed was ready. The soil turned and broken up and freed of everything that had been choking it. She pressed the seeds in with her thumb, one by one, basil and rosemary and mint, working in the rows the original planting had established, following the logic of what had already been decided about this soil by someone who had known it. Each seed was a choice. She understood that clearly, kneeling in the dirt with her fingers in the cold earth and the mountain afternoon going golden around her. This was not optimism. It was not faith in any particular outcome. It was simply the decision that this was where she was, and so this was what she would do with where she was. The seeds would take, or they would not. The garden would come back, or it would not. She was not in the business of guarantees. She was in the business of doing the work in front of her and seeing what followed. That evening she set 2 plates on the table, the same as every evening. Cormac came in from the barn at dusk. He washed his hands at the basin. He looked at the table, and then, without comment, without announcement, he pulled out the good chair and sat down across from her, not at the window, not standing, across from her, at the table, the way a person sits when they intend to eat a meal in a room with another person. He did not speak. She did not make the mistake of filling the silence with words it did not need. They ate, and the fire burned in the stove, and outside the first stars appeared over the ridge. When his plate was empty, he set his fork down and sat for a moment longer than he needed to before he stood. That was all. That was enough. She cleared the plates and did not smile about it, because it was not the kind of moment that should be smiled about. It was small and real, and she understood it for what it was. A single step. Not a promise. Not a turning point. Just a man sitting down at his own table. That night, she lay on the rope bed and looked at the ceiling and thought, 1 week more. They came on a Thursday morning in the last week of September. Nora heard the hoofbeats before she saw them, the sound carrying ahead of the riders through the cold mountain air with that quality that means more than one horse moving at speed. She was in the kitchen garden, on her knees in the far corner finishing the last of the clearing work, when she heard it. She stood up and turned toward the trail. 3 riders crested the rise and came down into the yard at a canter. They were not neighbors. She understood that immediately, and without being able to say precisely why. There was something in the way they rode, the way they spread out as they entered the yard without being told to, taking up space in the practiced manner of men who were used to arriving somewhere and making their presence felt. The one in front was heavy-set, somewhere in his 50s, with a broad red face and a jacket that was too good for the mountain and not quite good enough for the city. He was missing a tooth on the left side of his smile, and he was smiling as he pulled up his horse and looked down at her. The second man dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, moving toward the porch steps with the easy ownership of someone who had decided in advance that nothing here could stop him. The third stayed by the horses and watched. Cormac was in the barn. She had heard him in there 20 minutes earlier, the steady sound of work. The barn door stood open, but he was not visible from where she stood. Nora pulled her hands from the dirt and stood up. She walked around the side of the cabin and up the porch steps before the second man reached them. Not quickly, not in a way that announced itself as anything other than a woman going to her own front door. She stopped on the porch and looked at the man in front. "Can I help you?" she said. The heavy-set man on the horse looked at her with the attention of someone recalculating. "You Holt's new wife," he said. "My husband is checking the north fence line," Nora said. "He won't be back until evening." The second man laughed, a short sound with no warmth in it. The man on the horse kept looking at her. "That's convenient," he said. Nora's heart was beating hard and steady against her ribs. She was aware of it the way you are aware of machinery operating correctly under pressure, present and functional, doing its job. Her hands were dirty from the garden, and she did not put them behind her back. She let them stay where they were. "There's coffee," she said, "if you'd like it." The words surprised her, even as she said them, not because they were wrong, but because they were right, because she understood in the moment of saying them exactly why they were the correct response to what was standing in front of her. These were men who expected either submission or defiance. She was offering them neither. She was offering them coffee, the oldest and most disarming of frontier courtesies, the thing that turned a confrontation into a transaction, and a transaction into something that could end without anyone losing face. Behind the riders, movement. Cormac stepped out of the barn. He did not shout. He did not run. He walked forward across the yard at the pace of a man who has been interrupted from something he intends to return to. A rifle resting across both forearms where everyone could see it, held in the easy way of someone who has carried one long enough that it has become as natural as breathing. The riders turned. The silence in the yard was complete. Nora stepped down from the porch. She did not look back at Cormac. She moved forward and positioned herself at the edge of the space between the strangers and her husband, not blocking, not challenging, just present, just there. A woman standing in her own yard on a Thursday morning. "There's coffee," she said again to the man on the horse. "And biscuits." The heavy-set man looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cormac and the rifle. Then he looked back at her. "You serious?" he said. "Yes." She walked back into the cabin. Her legs were not entirely steady on the steps, but she kept them straight through an act of will that she had been practicing for years. She took the coffee from the back of the stove where it had been sitting since breakfast. She found the biscuits she had made that morning, 4 of them left, and put them on a tin plate. She breathed until her hands stopped their slight trembling. Then she picked up the tray and carried it back outside without spilling anything. Cormac stood still in the yard, jaw set, rifle ready. The heavy-set man had dismounted. Nora set the tray on the top of the chopping block and poured coffee into tin cups with the steadiness of a woman who has done this in easier circumstances and in worse. She did not look at anyone's face while she poured. She let the smell of the coffee do its work. The heavy-set man came forward slowly and picked up a cup. He held it in both hands and looked at her over the rim. "Heard some strays come through this area last week," he said finally. His voice had changed. It was still careful, but the edge of it was gone. Wondered if Holt had seen them. "Haven't," Cormac said from behind her. His voice was rough from not being used. The man drained the cup, set it down with a care that meant something, That was its own small concession. "Obliged," he said. He turned back to his horse. The second man grabbed a biscuit and followed. The third, who had never dismounted, turned his horse first. They rode out of the yard at a walk, back up the trail the way they had come, and did not look back. Nora stood next to the chopping block and did not sit down until the sound of hooves had faded completely into the trees. Cormac lowered the rifle. She heard him come up beside her. She was looking at the empty tin cups on the chopping block, at the biscuit plate with one biscuit remaining, at the ordinary objects of an ordinary morning that had just been something other than ordinary. "They could have hurt you," he said. "They were leaving. You don't know that." She looked at him. "I do now." He stared at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was not quite confusion and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two, like a man trying to identify a sound he has heard before but cannot place. "You protected me," he said. The words sounded strange to him. As he said them, she could tell, unfamiliar in his mouth. Nora shook her head. "I protected both of us." She picked up the tray and went back inside. That evening, he came in while the sun was still above the ridge. Not at dusk, not at dark, but in the late afternoon when the light was still gold and the shadows were still long and the day had not yet decided to be over. He came in and he washed his hands and he sat down at the table in the good chair and he stayed there. They ate in silence that felt different from the silences before it. Not empty, not cold. Something else, something that had weight without being heavy, like the quality of air before rain, full of what was coming without yet being it. When the plates were cleared and the lamp was lit, and there was no more reason to sit that was practical or necessary, he sat. The lamp flickered in the draft from the window. "Claire was my wife," he said. Then he stopped, as if the name itself had cost him something just to say out loud. Nora was still. She made no sound and no movement that might interrupt him. "She died 3 years ago, next month. October." He paused. "She and the baby both." The lamp burned. Outside, the mountain wind moved against the walls. "The fever came fast," he said. 3 days from the first symptoms. I was out on the south fence when it started. She sent the boy from the neighboring place to find me, but by the time I got back..." He stopped again. The stopping was not for effect. It was the genuine stop of a man who has reached a place where language has been used up. "She was gone before I came through the door." He did not wipe the tears that moved through his beard. He did not seem to notice them. "The garden was hers," he said. "She planted it that spring because she wanted fresh herbs when she was nursing. She had ideas about what she was going to grow. She talked about it." Something shifted in his face. I couldn't look at it after, so I let it go. The room held the truth of it the way a room will when something that has been kept in a small space is finally allowed to take up the room it actually requires. "The others," he said. "The women the agency sent. I thought if I called them help instead of wives, it wouldn't be so much. But every time one of them tried to fix something or cook something or change something in this room, I could only see what was wrong with it, not them, what was wrong with me for wanting them not to." He looked at his hands on the table. "So I made it easy for them to leave." He raised his eyes to her then. "But you didn't leave." "I chose not to," Nora said. He nodded slowly, like a man receiving information he had not expected to receive. Outside, something had gone very still in the mountain night. The wind had dropped. The pines were quiet. It was the stillness that falls between things, between what has been said and what will be said next, between what was and what is still possible. "There's a man," he said, "Harlan Doyle. He owns the land to the east. He's been after this place for 2 years." Nora said nothing. "The creek that runs through the south pasture," he said. "It's the only reliable water source for 20 miles. Whoever controls it controls the grazing for the whole valley. Doyle knows that." He was quiet for a moment. "I borrowed money from him 3 years ago when Claire was sick. Medical supplies, the doctor from Glenwood. It was $80. His jaw tightened. "He came last spring with a paper that said 200. Said I'd misremembered the terms." Nora looked at him steadily. "I don't have $200, he said. It was not complaint. It was not self-pity. It was the flat statement of a fact that had been sitting in the cabin with him for a long time, taking up space. "I've got the ranch and the herd, and I've got until the end of October. After that, he takes the land to settle the debt." The lamp burned low between them. Nora thought about the sack she had carried up the mountain. She thought about the seeds she had pressed into the soil one by one. She thought about the 4 women who had been here before her and the calculation each of them must have made when they understood what they were standing in the middle of. She thought about the $80 and the $200 and the space between them where a man's ranch and a woman's new life were both currently residing. "Show me the account books," she said. He looked at her. "Your records, whatever you have. Show me what you've got and what you owe, and what's still moving on the land." She held his gaze without flinching. "I kept books for my father's dry goods shop from the time I was 14. I know what numbers are supposed to look like, and I know what it looks like when they've been changed." A long silence. Then Cormac Holt stood up from the table and went to the shelf above the stove and brought down a battered ledger and set it in front of her without a word. She opened it. She did not look up for a long time. Late that night, with the cabin dark and Cormac asleep on his bedroll in the corner, Nora sat at the table with the ledger open and a piece of paper beside it and worked through the numbers by the light of the last candle. The ranch carried a herd of just over 60 cattle in the summer pasture and another 20 in the lower field. The market price in Glenwood that fall was $12 a head for good stock. There was a section of the herd, the western group, 30 animals that Cormac had noted in the ledger as ready to move before winter. 30 animals at $12 was $360. Enough for the 200 Doyle claimed. Enough, moreover, to also cover the $80 the debt had actually been and still leave money for the winter. She wrote the numbers carefully on the piece of paper and set it beside the ledger. Then she looked at the ledger again, at Doyle's original entry, at the ink that recorded the transaction from 3 years ago. She looked at it for a long time. The numbers had not simply been misremembered. She was sure of that in the way she had been sure of many things over the years, the way you are sure when you have been trained to look at columns of figures and understand what they are telling you. The shape of the 80 was still there, faintly, under the shape of the 200. The ink was different, not dramatically, not clumsily, but different. She did not say anything about it yet. She closed the ledger and blew out the candle and sat for a moment in the dark. Through the window, For the first time in 8 nights, there was no lantern burning in the barn. The barn was dark. The yard was dark. And from the corner of the cabin, she could hear the slow, even sound of a man breathing in sleep. Not the careful, shallow breathing of someone who is only pretending, but the deep and unguarded sound of someone who had, for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to go all the way under. Nora sat in the dark and listened to it. Then she folded the piece of paper with the numbers on it and set it on the table for morning. She went to bed. Outside, a single cloud moved across the face of the full moon, and the yard went briefly dark and then light again. And the mountain held everything in its cold and its patience. And in the garden behind the cabin, invisible under the frost, the first seeds that had been pressed into the earth that afternoon were already doing what seeds do in darkness, what they do without witness or encouragement, what they have always done. They were beginning. She put the paper in front of him before he had finished his first cup of coffee, not dramatically, not with the weight of announcement. She simply set it on the table beside his cup the way she set everything down, with the quiet certainty of someone who has already decided that the thing is worth doing and does not require an audience for the doing of it. Cormac looked at it. He picked it up. She watched his eyes move across the numbers. She had written them plainly. No embellishment, no commentary, just the columns and the totals, and at the bottom, the single line that told him what it meant. He read it twice. She could tell by the small movement of his eyes going back to the top. He set the paper down. "The Western herd," he said, 30 head, $12 at Glenwood Market. You noted them as ready to move before November. That leaves the ranch short for winter. The eastern pasture carries enough for spring. You've noted it yourself." She touched the ledger on the table between them. "The numbers are there. You wrote them." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the early morning was doing what October mornings do at altitude, coming in cold and clear with a light that had something final in it. The quality of light that knows it is running out of warmth and is spending what remains carefully. "How do you know how to do this?" he said. Nora wrapped both hands around her cup. "My father ran a dry goods store in Philadelphia. Not a large one. He kept the books himself until his eyes went. After that, I kept them." She paused. "I was 14 when I started. He used to say I had a mind for numbers because I didn't trust them." Something moved at the edge of Cormac's expression, not quite a smile. The shadow of one, maybe. The memory of what a smile felt like. "What does that mean?" "It means I check them," she said. "I never assume a column is right just because it adds up." He looked at the paper again. Then he looked at her with the same expression he had worn the evening before. The one she was beginning to understand was his version of careful attention, the way other men might lean forward or ask questions. He went still when something mattered to him. "All right," he said. 2 words. She took them for what they were. The days that followed had a different quality. Not warmer, exactly. The mountain did not traffic in easy warmth, and neither did the man who lived on it. But the temperature of the silence between them had shifted in some way that she felt in practical terms, in the small adjustments of daily life that are the actual language of people who live in close quarters and have not yet found words for what they are becoming to each other. He began leaving the barn door open in the mornings when he worked so that sound carried into the yard. She began making enough coffee for 2 without thinking about it as a decision. He repaired the gate on the south pasture fence without mentioning it. She noticed the repair and did not mention it either. These were small things. She knew they were small things. She also knew that small things, accumulated over enough days, have a weight that larger gestures cannot match. On the 3rd day of October, she was in the garden when she heard him behind her. "The rosemary came up," he said. She looked down. He was right. Along the middle row, where she had pressed the seeds in nearly 2 weeks ago, the faintest green was visible at the surface of the soil. Not much. The suggestion of it, really, the beginning of a beginning. "It's early," she said. "There'll be frost before it establishes. I can put stones along the north edge, hold the heat." She looked at him. He was looking at the row of green, not at her. "That would help," she said. He nodded once and went to the creek. He came back with stones, the same smooth gray river stones that had been used to border the bed originally, she noticed, gathered from the same source by the same hands that had first placed them there. He set them along the north edge of the rosemary row with the same care that had been put into the original border, unhurried, choosing each stone with the attention of someone for whom this kind of work is not tedious, but simply what the moment requires. Nora watched him and then went back to what she had been doing, and they worked in the garden together for the first time without either of them having decided to. On the 5th day of October, the horse went down. She heard it in the early morning, before full light. A sound from the barn that was wrong in the specific way that animal sounds are wrong when an animal is in distress. She was dressed and outside before she had fully made the decision to be. Cormac was already in the barn. He was kneeling beside the large bay horse, the one she had seen him work with most mornings, the one whose movement in the pasture had the quality of an animal that knows its own value. The horse was on its side. Its breathing was labored and irregular. Its right foreleg, even in the low light, was visibly swollen from the knee down. "How long?" she said. "Don't know." He was standing at midnight. "I checked." Cormac's voice was flat, but his hands on the horse's neck were not flat. They were the hands of a man trying to give something through touch that he did not have language for. "Nearest vet is in Glenwood, 20 miles. Nora was already looking at the leg. She had seen this before, not in horses, but in the general principle of it, in the way infection moves through a limb when it is not addressed. The swelling had a heat to it that she could feel without touching. The skin was tight. "I need the garden," she said. He looked at her. "Comfrey if it survived, and whatever yarrow you might have dried." She was already moving toward the door. "Boiling water, clean cloth." She did not wait for his answer. She had not been sure the comfrey had taken. It was stubborn even in good conditions, and these were not good conditions. But she had seen the leaves, small and rough, and exactly what they were supposed to be, pushing up in the far corner of the bed 3 days ago. She gathered what there was, more than she had hoped for, less than she would have liked. She found the yarrow in the dried herbs she had hung from the kitchen beams the previous week. Still good, still useful. She worked at the stove while Cormac sat with the horse in the barn, talking to it in the low, continuous way that people talk to animals when there is nothing practical left to do, and the talking itself becomes the thing. She carried the poultice to the barn and applied it without ceremony, working quickly and with the focused attention she had learned from her mother and her mother's mother before her. The knowledge that passes between women in kitchens and sick rooms across generations. The knowledge that does not get written in books because it belongs to hands rather than pages. "This will reduce the heat," she said. It won't fix what's wrong underneath. If there's something broken, we can't set it ourselves. But if it's infection, this gives him a chance. Cormac watched her work. She could feel him watching, not in the way that makes a person self-conscious, but in the way of someone paying attention that precedes understanding, the way you watch a thing when you are trying to learn it rather than simply to see it. "Where did you learn this?" he said. "My mother, and her mother before her." She smoothed the cloth over the poultice and secured it carefully. "Women in my family kept kitchen gardens and knew what each plant was for. My grandmother delivered half the babies in her county and set bones besides." She sat back on her heels. "I kept the knowledge because it seemed wrong to let it go." "Your husband didn't object?" The question was careful. She understood the care in it. "My husband," she said, "did not pay sufficient attention to most of what I did to object to any of it." Cormac said nothing, but she felt the shift in him, the small adjustment of a person who has just been given a piece of information they are going to sit with for a while. She stood up and wiped her hands. "I'll need to change the poultice twice a day," she said. "It will take 3 days before we know if it's working." She changed it that evening, and again in the morning, and again that evening. She did not ask Cormac to help, and he did not offer. But each time she came to the barn, he was already there with the horse, sitting or crouching beside it in the way of someone maintaining a vigil. On the second night, she came out at midnight to check the heat in the leg, and found him asleep against the stall wall with his shoulder pressed to the horse's flank. She changed the poultice without waking him. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment before she went back in, looking at the two of them, the large man and the large horse, both of them asleep in the hay, both of them breathing in the slow, synchronized way of creatures that have given themselves over to rest without reservation. She thought about the lantern burning alone in this same doorway every night she had been here. She thought about the difference between then and now, and whether she had caused that difference or merely witnessed it. She walked back to the cabin and lay down on the rope bed and listened to the mountain and did not sleep for a long time. On the third morning, the horse stood up, not steadily, not without effort, but it stood, and it put weight on the leg. And when Cormac ran his hand down from the knee, the heat was gone, and the swelling had begun to ease. He stood there with his hand on the horse's leg for a long moment, saying nothing. Nora was at the stall door. He straightened up and turned toward her, and something had changed in his face, something more significant than what she had seen before. It was not gratitude exactly, though it was that too. It was recognition, the look of a person who has just understood something about another person that they had not expected to understand. He crossed the barn and stopped 2 feet from her. "Thank you," he said. She had not expected him to say it, not because he was ungracious, but because she had learned that he expressed things through action rather than language. The fixed gate, the stones along the garden border, the coffee she sometimes found already made when she came into the kitchen in the early morning. The words, because they were not his usual currency, cost him something. She could tell. "He's a good horse," she said. "He was worth the effort." That night, Cormac did not go to the barn after dinner. For the first time since she had arrived on this mountain, he sat in the cabin until the fire burned low and the lamp guttered and the night was fully settled around the walls. He sat in his chair and she sat at the table, and they occupied the same room in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable left in it, that had become simply the natural atmosphere of two people who had found a way to be in the same space without requiring anything of each other that the other could not give. At some point, she realized his shoulder was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. The cabin felt like the right size for what was inside it. It was on a Thursday evening, with rain coming down steady and flat against the roof, and the stove burning high, and the cabin full of the smell of wood smoke and the dried herbs hanging from the beams, that he told her about the doll. He had been carving for an hour. She had noticed the carving beginning several days earlier, a piece of pine he had picked up from the woodpile and been shaping in the evenings with a small knife, the shape of it emerging slowly under his hands. She had not asked what it was. She could see it was a spoon. The handle was nearly finished. "Claire made it," he said. She looked up from the mending in her lap. The doll. He did not look up from the wood. She made it the spring before she died. She was already carrying the baby. She used to sew in the evenings, and she made the doll, and she said. He stopped. He turned the piece of wood in his hands. She said she didn't know yet whether it was a girl or a boy, and it didn't matter. She just wanted to have it ready. The rain came down. "I found it after," he said. "I put it away. I couldn't put it in the ground because that felt like giving up on something I wasn't ready to give up on. And I couldn't look at it because..." He set the carving down on his knee. "So I put it in the garden and covered it, and I let the weeds come." Nora did not speak. "You found it," he said. "Yes." "I walked up into the trees because I didn't know what to do with myself when I saw it on the window." He picked up the carving again. "That hadn't happened in a long time, not knowing what to do with myself." "I shouldn't have put it where you could see it without warning," she said. "No." He shook his head. It was right. It needed to come out of the ground. He was quiet for a moment. "She should have been buried with it. I know that. I just couldn't." "When you're ready," Nora said quietly, "we can do that." He looked at her then, directly, fully, the way he rarely looked at anyone, holding the eye contact for long enough that she did not look away from it. "You're not what I expected," he said. She thought about the woman who had stood at the base of the mountain trail 8 weeks ago with a carpet bag and $43 and a piece of paper with a stranger's name on it. "Neither are you," she said. The next morning, she went to Greystone for flour. She had a second reason, one she had not mentioned to Cormac, one she had been carrying since the night she had sat with the ledger by candlelight and understood what she was looking at. She went to the general store and bought the flour and made conversation with Silas Webb in the easy manner of a woman who is asking an incidental question rather than the question she actually came to ask. Or, "You've been keeping records here a long time," she said. 20 years, Webb said, wrapping her flour. "Do you keep your own copies of credit transactions when someone runs an account?" Webb looked at her with the careful eyes of a man who has learned to identify the shape of a situation before stepping into it. "I keep everything," he said. "Why?" She told him what she needed. Not everything. Enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the back room and came out with a large bound ledger, older than the one at the ranch, its cover worn to softness at the corners. He set it on the counter and opened it to a page and turned it to face her. She looked at the entry, the date, the name, the amount, $80. Silas Webb's handwriting was very different from Doyle's. The 80 in Webb's ledger was rounded at the top and open at the base, The formation of a man who had written that number 10,000 times. The 200 in Cormac's ledger had been written in the same hand on top of a shape that, if you knew what you were looking for, still remembered being something else. "He changed it," she said. Not a question. Webb looked at the page and looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I've had my suspicions for some time about Doyle's methods. This is the second time in 5 years someone's come to me with a concern about a transaction he was party to. May I bring someone to look at this? The page will be here," he said, "as long as I'm here." Nora folded her flower money carefully and put it in her coat. She was almost to the door when Webb spoke again. "Mrs. Holt." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression that had lost some of its careful neutrality. "That horse he keeps. The bay. Word came through last week that Doyle was asking around about whether Holt might be looking to sell his herd early. Seemed to know the horse had been sick." Nora turned. "Doyle has someone in this valley telling him things," she said. "That's my belief," Webb said. She thanked him and walked out into the gray October morning. She stood on the porch of the general store for a moment with the flower under her arm and the cold coming down off the ridge and the clarity that arrives when something you have suspected becomes something you know. Doyle was not waiting for the debt to come due naturally. He was arranging for it not to be payable. The western herd, the sick horse, the timing of all of it. She looked up at the mountain. Then she got on her horse and rode back up. She did not tell Cormac everything that evening. She told him about the ledger in Webb's store, about the $80 and the shape of the 200 written over it. She set the information in front of him plainly, the way she set everything in front of him, without embellishment and without softening. He sat with it for a long time. "I knew the number was wrong," he said finally. "I knew it, but I couldn't prove it, and a man's word against a signed paper in this territory." He stopped. "It's not just your word anymore," she said. He looked at the table, at the ledger, at his hands. "Why did you go looking for this?" he said. She thought about the honest answer to that. She thought about the night she had sat by the candle with the ledger and seen the shape of the original number under the revised one and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific anger of a person who recognizes injustice not as an abstraction but as a thing with a face and a signature, because someone changed what was true into what was convenient, she said. "And I have spent enough of my life inside someone else's convenient version of the truth." Cormac looked at her with the full weight of his attention. The fire burned. The rain had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the mountain was very quiet, and the dried herbs moved faintly in the draft from the window, and the spoon that was almost finished lay on the chair where he had left it, and the lamp made everything in the cabin amber and close. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it the way you feel the first warm day after a long winter. Not dramatically, not with surprise exactly, but with the deep recognition of something your body knew was coming before your mind caught up. "Yes," she said. He did not say anything else for a moment. He just sat with her name in the air between them, in this room, on this mountain, in this life that neither of them had planned and both of them were still deciding what to do with. "What do we do with the ledger?" he said. She looked at him. "We wait until we need it," she said, "and we make sure it's still there when we do." He nodded once. Outside, through the window, the sky had cleared after the rain and the stars over the ridge were sharp and abundant and cold, the way stars are in October at altitude, with the brightness of things that have nothing between them and you but distance and dark. The garden was out there somewhere in the night, the rosemary and the basil and the herbs that were coming back from 3 years of being left alone, and the smooth gray stones along the north edge holding whatever warmth remained from the day that had just finished. The horse was on its feet in the barn. The spoon was almost done, and at the table in the cabin, 2 people sat close enough that the warmth of one reached the other, and the night settled around them both, and the mountain outside held its cold and its patience. And for the first time in a long time, the cabin felt like the right size for what was inside it. Harlan Doyle came on a Monday, not with 2 men this time, alone, which was worse. A man who comes with companions is making a show of strength. A man who comes alone has already decided the outcome. Nora was inside when she heard the single horse in the yard. She looked through the window and watched him dismount with the unhurried ease of someone who has nowhere to be that matters more than here. He tied his horse to the fence post, smoothed his jacket, and looked at the cabin with the patient expression of a man reading a deed he already owns. Cormac came from the barn. They spoke in the yard. Nora could not hear the words through the glass, but she did not need to. She watched Cormac's posture, the way it changed across the length of the conversation, the slight forward lean at the beginning that was attention, the stillness that followed that was control, and then the stillness that was something else entirely, the stillness of a man holding himself in check against something that wants to move. Doyle talked for a long time. He gestured once toward the south pasture, once toward the creek. Then he looked directly at the cabin window, at her. He held it for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to Cormac, said something short, and walked back to his horse. He mounted without haste and rode out of the yard at a walk, the way a man leaves a place when he knows he will be back on his own terms. Cormac stood in the yard until the hoofbeats faded. Then he came inside. He did not speak immediately. He went to the basin and poured water and stood with his hands in it, not washing them, just standing there, looking at the wall above the basin with the expression of a man doing internal mathematics that is not coming out to a number he can work with. "He knows about the ledger," Cormac said. Nora set down what she was holding. "Webb," she said. "No." He pulled his hands from the water and dried them slowly. "Webb wouldn't. But Doyle has ears in that store, and he doesn't need Webb to tell him. He only needs someone to have noticed you asking questions." He turned. "He said he knows I've been looking into the terms of the debt. He said a man who can't honor what he signed deserves what follows." His jaw tightened. "He said smart women know when to stop asking questions about things that don't concern them." The last sentence sat in the room between them. Nora felt the anger of it move through her cleanly, without heat, which was the way real anger moved when it had somewhere to go. She did not let it into her face. "When is the deadline?" she said. 3 weeks, end of October. The Western herd. If we move them now, at current market, we can cover the 200 he's claiming." He looked at her. "But if he has someone watching the herd, and the number drops before we move them?" "He'd arrange that. He's already arranged it once." The words were quiet and certain. The horse, the timing. Doyle knowing the animal had been sick before word could have traveled through normal channels. She saw Cormac understand fully, perhaps for the first time, the whole shape of what he was standing in the middle of. "He doesn't want the money," Nora said. "No." He wants the creek. He always wanted the creek. Cormac sat down heavily in the chair. The money was the method, not the point. She looked at him sitting there, this large and careful man who had been keeping this mountain together with the same quality of stubborn persistence that he brought to everything, quietly, without complaint, without asking anyone to notice. She thought about the clean nails on the day she arrived, the bucket of cold water set beside her without a word, the stones along the garden border that he had carried from the creek and placed there 3 years ago for a woman who had wanted fresh herbs for nursing and had not lived to use them. She thought about 3 years of sitting with this. "We go to Glenwood," she said. "We take Webb's ledger and your ledger, and we put them in front of someone with authority before the end of this month. Doyle has friends in Glenwood. Does he have friends in every office in Glenwood?" Cormac looked at the table. "I'll think on it," he said. She understood what that meant. It meant he was not ready. It meant the weight of the thing was sitting on him in a way that needed time to shift. She did not push. She had learned that pushing Cormac Holt toward a decision was the surest way to make him stand still. She let it rest. She went to the garden instead. She worked there for 2 hours in the cold afternoon, doing nothing urgent, just the ordinary tending that a garden in October requires, pulling the last of the dead growth from the edges of the beds, pressing the soil down around the stems of the rosemary where the frost had lifted it, moving the stones Cormac had placed to better catch the low November sun. She did not think about Doyle while she worked. She did not think about the herd or the ledger or the deadline. She thought about the soil under her hands, which was the same soil it had always been, which had grown what it was asked to grow, and would grow what it was asked to grow again, which did not know anything about debts or deadlines or the complicated arrangements that people made with each other in the name of money. The garden did not know it was supposed to be lost. That seemed important. 4 days later, on a Friday night, the cattle were gone. She woke to the sound of it, or rather to the absence of sound that follows something that has just happened, the silence after a gate swings open in the dark, after hooves move across grass in too many directions at once. She was dressed and outside before the full shape of the thing had assembled itself in her mind. Cormac was already at the south pasture fence. The gate stood open. The pasture was empty. In the moonlight, she could see the churned earth where the herd had moved through in a mass, the hoof marks going in every direction the way spooked cattle move, without logic, away from whatever had startled them and into whatever darkness received them. Cormac stood at the fence with one hand on the post and looked out at the empty pasture. He stood there for a long time without speaking. She counted, later, 34 animals lost from the western section. Some would come back in the morning when the panic faded and the grass called them home. Some would not. The ones that did not come back would be scattered across 20 miles of mountain terrain, on Doyle's land and on public land and in gullies and creek beds, where recovering them would cost more in time and labor than they were worth at market. The plan was gone. The numbers she had written on that piece of paper at the kitchen table in the candlelight were gone with it. She came and stood beside him at the fence. The night was very cold. Her breath made a small cloud in the dark and dispersed. The moon was 3/4 full, and the empty pasture was silver under it, the grass moving in the mountain wind with the indifferent beauty of something that does not know what has just happened on it. She sat down on the ground with her back against the fence post. After a moment, Cormac sat down beside her, not near her. 2 feet of distance between them, the same careful distance he had always maintained, but down, on the ground, in the cold, at the fence of his empty pasture, down at the level where the loss actually was. She did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying that the night was not already saying on its own. They sat there for a long time. In the morning, he did not come in for breakfast. She made it anyway and left his plate covered on the back of the stove where it would stay warm. She went out to the barn and found him there with the horses, doing the work of the morning with the mechanical persistence of a man who is running on something other than hope. She watched him from the door without announcing herself. His movements were right. He was doing everything correctly. But there was something different in the quality of it. Something that was not quite right underneath the correctness, the way a clock can keep perfect time while the spring inside it is slowly winding to its end. She went back to the cabin. She was standing at the stove when he came in an hour later. He did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands and looked at a point somewhere between the floor and the wall. "Nora," he said. She turned. He did not look up immediately. When he did, she saw what she had been watching approach for the last several days. Not anger, not defeat exactly. Something more fundamental than either. The expression of a man who has reached the edge of what he can hold and found that the holding has cost him something he did not know he was spending. "I don't know how to do this," he said. She waited. "I don't know how to keep fighting something I cannot see clearly enough to fight." His voice was steady, and she understood that the steadiness was the last of what he had, not composure, but the shape of composure being maintained by will alone. "I have been trying to hold this land together for 3 years, before you came, and after. And every time I think I have a hand on it, something I cannot reach gets in front of it." He looked at her. "Claire died because I wasn't there," he said. "I was at that fence. I thought I had time. I thought the fence was the urgent thing." He set his hat on the table. "I have made that calculation wrong more than once. I keep choosing the practical thing and losing the real thing. And I am." He stopped. "I am very tired of losing." Something in his face finally moved in a way it had not moved before. Something behind the careful control that he carried like a second skin. Something that had been kept in a smaller and smaller space for 3 years and had run out of room. His eyes did not fill the way some men's eyes fill, slowly and with warning. They simply changed, the way light changes when a cloud takes the sun, sudden and complete. He did not reach up to stop it. He stood in the middle of his cabin with his hat on the table and let it happen. One thing she had learned about Cormac Holt across these weeks was that he did not do things he did not mean. Not words, and not gestures, and not this. This was not performance. This was a man who had finally set something down that he had been carrying for too long in a space too small for it. She crossed the room. She did not touch him. She stood in front of him, close enough that he could see her face clearly, and she waited until his eyes came to hers. "Cormac," she said. He looked at her. "You are not losing this." He shook his head, a small movement. "Nora, the numbers don't. The numbers are not finished." She kept her voice level and certain, not because she was performing certainty, but because she had it. She had been turning this over since the moment she had sat down on the ground at the fence post in the dark. "We still have the ledger in Webb's store. We still have the original entry." The western herd being scattered does not change what Doyle wrote over what he owed you. It changes our ability to pay a fraudulent debt. It does not change the fact that the debt is fraudulent. He looked at her steadily. We don't need to pay $200, she said. We need to prove we never owed $200. The room was quiet. There is a difference, she said, between surrendering to a problem and solving it. You have been trying to find enough money to make the problem go away. I am telling you, the problem was never about money. He picked up his hat from the table, turned it in his hands, set it down again. He has people in Greystone, he said. He has one person in Greystone, possibly two. He does not own Greystone. She looked at him. There is a land office in Glenwood. There is a territorial judge who comes through on the second Tuesday of each month. The second Tuesday of November is in 12 days. Cormac was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She understood that for him, the thinking happened in silence, and interrupting the silence was interrupting the thinking. She went to the stove and brought his breakfast plate to the table and set it down and sat across from him. He sat down. He ate. Slowly, methodically, the way he did everything, with the full attention of a man who has decided a thing is worth doing. When his plate was empty, he set the fork down. I'll need to ride to Glenwood to find out which judge is on the November circuit, he said. I'll ride with you, she said. He looked at her. You kept the ledger evidence, she said. You'll want someone who can explain what they found in it and how. She held his gaze. That's me. A long moment. All right, he said. She was saddling her horse in the early dark of the following morning, the day before they were to ride to Glenwood, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find it was not Cormac. It was a boy, perhaps 12, from the Alderman place 3 miles down the valley. He was out of breath, and his horse was lathered, and he held out a folded note without preamble. Mr. Doyle asked me to bring this, he said. She took it. She read it there in the barn by the lantern light, with her horse warm against her shoulder and the mountain dark outside the open door. The note was short. It said that Doyle had been informed of her visit to Silas Webb and her questions about historical account records. It said that a woman who involved herself in matters of legal debt on behalf of a man she had known for 7 weeks might find that her own history became a matter of interest to the same authorities she was hoping to engage. It said that Philadelphia was not so far away that a few questions could not be asked about the circumstances surrounding the late Edmund Voss and the debts he had left behind. It said, in the language that men like Doyle used when they wanted to wound without leaving marks, a smart woman knows when she is out of her depth. She folded the note. She stood in the barn for a moment with the lantern burning and her horse breathing warm against her shoulder and the mountain dark pressing at the open door. She thought about Edmund, about the debts that had not been hers, and the consequences that had been, about the tidy efficiency with which a dead man's failures had been arranged into a trap for his living wife, about how many times, in the year since his death, she had been told in one language or another that she was out of her depth. She thought about a garden that had been declared dead. She put the note in her coat pocket. She finished saddling her horse. Then she walked back to the cabin and sat down at the table. And by the light of the lamp, she wrote out, from memory, every figure from Cormac's ledger that was relevant to the debt, every date, every entry in Doyle's handwriting, and beside each one she noted what Webb's ledger showed for the same transaction. She wrote it in the clear, careful hand her father had taught her, the hand she had used for 15 years of keeping books that other people depended on to be accurate. She did not wake Cormac. She worked until the lamp needed trimming and the fire had settled low, and the mountain outside was beginning its slow turn toward the gray that preceded dawn. When she was finished, she had 4 pages in her own hand, a complete record of the discrepancy between what had been lent and what was being claimed, laid out in the language of columns and dates and amounts that had always been the language she trusted most when she needed to make something undeniable. She set the pages on the table. She trimmed the lamp. She sat for a moment in the near dark and let herself feel, fully and without apology, what she had been holding at a distance for the past several days. The fear of it. The real and genuine fear of a woman who understood that Doyle's reach was not nothing, that her history was not clean in the way that histories are clean when nothing bad has ever happened to you, that she was operating in territory where the rules had not been written with her in mind. She felt it, and then she set it aside in the way she had learned to set things aside, not by pretending they were not there, but by looking at them directly until they became the size they actually were, rather than the size fear made them. Doyle knew she had been asking questions. That meant the questions had found something worth knowing. And a man who sends warning notes in the dark of the morning is a man who has already lost the argument and knows it. Cormac found her at the table in the early light. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room the way he always read rooms, quietly and completely. He saw the pages on the table. He saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She gave him the note. He read it standing. When he finished, he folded it exactly as she had folded it and held it in his hand and looked at the far wall with an expression she had not seen before. Something colder and more focused than anger. "He threatened you," he said. "He tried to. Nora." "Cormac." She looked at him steadily. "He has nothing real. Philadelphia is 8 weeks behind me, and the debts he is referring to were my husband's, not mine. And there is not a judge in this territory who will refuse to look at a fraudulent ledger because a woman's dead husband owed money to someone in Pennsylvania." She touched the 4 pages on the table. "This is what matters. This is what we bring to Glenwood." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the pages she had written in the night, the careful columns, the dates, the evidence assembled in the dark while he slept, by a woman who had gotten up before dawn, and sat down with what was true, and arranged it into something that could not be ignored. He picked them up. He read through them slowly, the way he read everything, with complete attention, as if the pages were the only thing in the room. When he finished, he set them down. "You did this last night," he said. "Yes." "After you got his note?" "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Outside, the morning was coming up cold and clear over the ridge, the clarity of an October morning that has decided to be honest about what it is. "Why?" he said. She looked at him across the table, across the 4 pages of careful handwriting, across the 7 weeks of this life she had walked up a mountain and chosen, and was still, in each successive morning, choosing again. "Because this is my home," she said. The words were simple, and she meant them simply, without drama, without the weight of announcement. They were just true. The way the stones along the garden border were true. The way the spoon on the shelf was true. The way the sound of his breathing in the dark was true, steady and present, and part of the same room as her own. Cormac picked up his hat. "We ride at first light tomorrow," he said. The morning before they rode to Glenwood, they buried the doll. Cormac carried it himself, still wrapped in the clean muslin Nora had folded around it weeks ago when she had taken it down from the windowsill. They walked to the cottonwood by the creek, the one that had stood through every storm the mountain had thrown at it. Its roots deep and its trunk thick and its branches bare now in the late October cold. The creek ran below them, low with the season, the water clear over the smooth stones of its bed. He dug the hole himself, without being asked and without ceremony, the way he did most things that mattered. The earth was cold and resistant at the surface and softer below, the way mountain soil always is, holding its warmth deeper down where frost cannot reach it. He placed the doll inside, still wrapped. He did not say anything over it. He did not need to. The act itself was the saying. He straightened up and stood there for a moment with the creek running behind them and the mountain above them and the sky going pale at the edges with the coming day. He did not speak. Neither did she. There was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying on its own. Not forgetting. Not replacing. Just putting something down in the right place, finally, after too long. When they walked back to the cabin, something had settled between them that had not been settled before. Not resolved. Settled. The way ground settles after a long rain, not changed, but more itself. Nora walked beside him, and their footsteps fell into the same rhythm on the frozen ground, without either of them arranging it. She thought about Claire, who had planted the garden and made the doll and called her husband's name at the end. She thought about how grief can be a kind of loyalty, and how loyalty can become a prison, and how the difference between the two sometimes comes down to a single morning and a choice made before the sun is all the way up. She thought, this is what it means to begin. Diamonds. They rode out before the sun cleared the ridge. The trail down to the valley was frozen at the edges where the night had settled into the earth and not yet released it. The grass white and stiff along both sides of the path. The creek below carrying a thin skin of ice at its margins that would be gone by noon. Nora rode slightly behind Cormac on the narrow sections and beside him where the trail widened, and neither of them spoke much, because there was nothing that needed saying that the morning was not already saying around them. She had the 4 pages folded inside her coat. She had the note from Doyle in a separate pocket. She had committed Webb's ledger entry to memory in the way she committed things that mattered, completely and without gaps, so that she could produce it without the paper if she had to. She was ready. She understood, riding down that mountain in the cold October morning, that she had been ready for this specific kind of moment for most of her adult life without knowing it. The years of keeping books that others depended on. The years of watching columns of numbers and understanding not just what they said, but what they were hiding. The years of sitting in rooms where decisions were made about her life by people who had not asked her opinion and learning, slowly and at considerable cost. The difference between silence that protects and silence that surrenders. She was not silent this morning. Cormac rode ahead on the narrow section just above the valley floor, and she watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he sat a horse, the way he did everything, with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who has spent enough years in the saddle to have stopped thinking about being in the saddle. She thought about what he had said on the ridge above Greystone, riding back from the land office the first time. She thought about what she had answered. She thought, yes. Still, yes. Again, yes. Diamonds. The land office in Glenwood occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on the main street, between a surveyor's office and a lawyer who handled mining claims. The clerk inside was a young man with careful handwriting and the efficiency of someone who has learned that his job is to process things rather than to feel about them. He looked up when they came in. "We need to speak with whoever handles debt disputes and land claims," Nora said. "We have documentation of a fraudulent alteration to a signed financial record." The clerk looked at Cormac, then back at Nora. Then he stood up and went through the door behind him without further discussion, which told her something useful about the kind of situation he recognized this to be. The man who came out was older, heavy-set, with the unhurried manner of someone whose authority is sufficiently established that he no longer needs to perform it. His name was Aldrich. He was not the circuit judge, who would not arrive until the second Tuesday of November, but he was the land office commissioner, and he had, as he told them without preamble, handled 4 cases involving Harlan Doyle in the past decade. He said this looking at neither of them in particular, which told her something useful about that too. He sat down across the desk and opened his hands. Nora put the 4 pages on the desk. She put Doyle's original note beside them. Then she spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, laying out the sequence of events, the original debt, the altered ledger, Webb's record, the scattered herd, the timing of all of it, in the same plain language she used for everything that mattered. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for sympathy. She presented what was true in the order in which it was true, and let the shape of it do what the shape of it could do. Aldrich read the 4 pages while she talked. He read them again after she finished. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3. Then he looked at Cormac. "You still have the original ledger from the ranch?" "Yes." "And Webb will confirm his own entry?" "He said the page would be there as long as he was," Nora said. Aldrich sat back. "The circuit judge on the second Tuesday of November will want to see all of it," he said. "The original ranch ledger, Webb's book, and your pages here." He tapped the desk. "I am going to send a writer to Doyle today informing him that this office is reviewing the terms of the debt pending a formal hearing. That stops the clock on his October deadline." He looked at them both. "I want to be clear that I cannot promise an outcome, but I can tell you that what you have brought me this morning is more than most people bring." He stood up and held out his hand to Cormac. Then he turned and held it out to Nora. She shook it. Diamonds. On the second Tuesday of November, the circuit judge reviewed the evidence. His name was Hargrove. He was a thin man with a precise manner and the eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for 30 years and had developed an efficient intolerance for it. He read Nora's 4 pages without expression. He examined Webb's ledger entry beside Cormac's. He asked Nora 2 questions about the methodology of the alteration, how she had identified it, what she knew about ink aging and handwriting variation, and she answered both in the plain language of a woman who has spent 15 years looking at numbers and understanding what they are hiding. When she finished, Hargrove looked at the pages for a long moment. Then he looked up. "This is not the first complaint this office has received regarding Mr. Doyle's record-keeping practices," he said. He closed the ledger with the finality of a door being shut on something that had gone on long enough. "It will be the last." He ruled the debt fraudulent in 11 minutes. Harlan Doyle did not attend, having been informed by his own lawyer the previous evening that attendance was not in his interest. Nora sat in the hard wooden chair in the land office and felt something release in her chest that she had not known was held. not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter than either. The feeling of a thing being made right that has been wrong long enough that the wrongness had started to feel permanent. She looked at Cormac beside her. He was looking at the judge's desk, at the closed ledger, at the irreversible fact of what had just happened. Then he looked at her. He said nothing. He did not need to. Diamonds. The debt was ruled fraudulent. The original amount of $80 was confirmed by Webb's testimony and his ledger. Cormac paid it before the end of the week from the sale of 12 head of cattle at Glenwood Market, well within what remained of the herd after the scattered animals were recovered. The ranch and the water rights to the creek through the south pasture remained in the name of Cormac Holt. Doyle did not come back to the mountain. Diamonds. They did not speak much on the ride home. The afternoon light was different from the morning light, lower and more golden, the kind of light that makes the mountain look like something that has been waiting all day to show you what it actually is. The aspens along the creek had gone fully gold, and the wind was pulling them loose in long, slow streams that crossed the trail in front of them and settled into the grass. Halfway up the mountain, Cormac stopped his horse. She pulled up beside him and looked at what he was looking at, which was the valley below them, the whole of Greystone, and the surrounding land spread out in the afternoon gold, the creek threading through the center of it, the ranch just visible above through the trees. He did not look at the view for long. He looked at her. "I thought you had left," he said. "The morning after Doyle's note came, when I woke and you were not inside, before I saw the pages on the table." She held his gaze. "I thought you had decided it was not worth it," he said, "that the note had been enough." He paused. "I thought I had waited too long to say what needed saying, and you had made your own decision without it." "What needed saying?" she said. He turned his horse so they were facing each other fully on the mountain trail, the aspens moving gold behind him, and the valley spread out below, and the light going that color that only happens once a day and only in November. "I do not want a housekeeper," he said. "I did not want one when I wrote the letter to that agency, and I knew it then, though I told myself otherwise. I wanted someone to be in the room, someone whose being in the room changed the room." He looked at her with the complete and unguarded attention that she had learned was his most honest expression. "You changed every room you walked into on that ranch. You changed the garden. You changed the barn. You changed the way I sit at my own table." A pause. "You changed me, and I would like, if you are willing, for that to continue, not as arrangement, as life." The aspens moved. The valley was very far below. Nora looked at this man who had handed her a sack of provisions and told her to leave, and had not once, in all the weeks since, actually wanted her to go. This man who carried his grief like river stones in his pockets, heavy and smooth and always present. This man who fixed things quietly and set water down without meeting her eyes, and had cried without hiding it, and said her name like it meant something when he finally said it. "I packed my bag once," she said. "The night Doyle's note came." He was very still. "I sat on the edge of the rope bed with the bag in my lap," she said, "and I thought about Philadelphia, about the rented room, about the letter I signed and the trail I climbed and the garden I pulled out of the ground with my bare hands." She looked at him steadily. "And then I unpacked it, because I did not come up this mountain to run from the next hard thing. I came up this mountain to stop running. He let out a breath that was not quite steady. Stay, he said. It was the simplest word he had ever said to her, and it cost him the most. Yes, she said. The mountain held them both in its cold, and its gold, and its long patience, and neither of them moved for a moment, and it was enough. It was exactly enough. Diamond Spring came late that year, the way it does at altitude, slowly and without apology, arriving in pieces rather than all at once. The snow was still on the north faces of the peaks in April when the garden began in earnest. Not just the rosemary and the herbs that had survived the winter under the stones Cormac had placed along the border. New things. Things Nora had ordered from a seed merchant in Denver in February, sitting at the kitchen table with the catalog and the knowledge of what this soil could hold, writing out the order in her clear, careful hand. She had ordered more than she needed, the way a person orders when they are planning not just for this season, but for the one after, and the one after that. The first morning she saw the new shoots, she stood in the garden for a long time. Cormac came and stood at the fence. The heirloom basil came up, she said. Which one is that? The one I ordered from the man in Denver, the Italian variety. She touched the small leaves carefully. My grandmother grew it. I haven't seen it since I was a child. He opened the gate and came into the garden. He stood beside her and looked down at the row of small green shoots, unremarkable to look at, carrying everything she had just told him. He reached down and rubbed one leaf gently between his fingers. He held his hand up toward her. She leaned in. The smell of it was particular and sharp and exactly what she remembered. Her grandmother's kitchen, summer afternoons, the specific green smell of something that had traveled a long way through time to be here. Smells like something new, he said. She looked at him, at his face in the April morning light, less guarded than it had been in September, not unguarded. That was not who he was, and she did not need it to be, but carrying less of the weight that had made him look like a man braced against something. He looked like a man standing in a garden on a spring morning. He looked like a man who had decided to be where he was. It is, she said. He straightened up and looked out at the full length of the garden, at the rows they had worked together through the fall, and the stones along the borders, and the woody stems of the herbs that had survived the winter and were putting out new growth in the April sun. Claire's heirloom rosemary in its established row, Nora's basil beside it, just beginning, not replacing, not erasing, just the next thing, growing in the same ground. He picked the small sprig of rosemary from the established row and held it out to her. She took it and held it with the basil leaf, and the two smells together were something she did not have a name for yet, but would in time. Come inside, he said. Coffee's on. She followed him through the garden gate and up the porch steps and through the cabin door. Inside, 2 cups sat on the table, 2 plates, 2 chairs, both of them whole, both of them pulled up to the same table. The spoon he had carved through the winter evenings lay on the kitchen shelf where she had put it the morning he finished it, the wood smooth and warm from being handled. The fire was already going. The lamp was turned low against the morning light coming through the window, through the curtains she had made from flour sacks in the first weeks, soft and faded now, moved by the draft that came in under the door. She sat down. He poured the coffee and sat across from her, the way he had been sitting across from her since the morning she had come back from Greystone with a heavy sack on her shoulders, and set it down on the porch, and refused, quietly and completely, to be the kind of woman who could be handed a sack of provisions and persuaded to disappear. The mountain was outside, wild and cold, and indifferent in all the ways that mountains are indifferent. The wind still finding the gaps in the cabin walls, the winter still present in the north-facing hollows, the work still there tomorrow and the day after, unglamorous and unending. And inside the cabin, a woman drank her coffee at a table in a room that was hers, in a life that was hers, that she had carried up a mountain on her own back and planted with her own hands, and refused to abandon when the ground was hard, and the season was against her. She thought about the woman who had stood at the base of that trail in September with $43 and a piece of paper and a carpet bag that was too heavy to carry comfortably, but she had carried it anyway. She thought about all the things that woman had not known yet. The silence, the bucket of cold water, the doll with one eye, the ledger and its lies and the truth she had found underneath them, the long cold nights and the slowly warming silences and the specific sound of a man's name when you finally allow yourself to say it like it means something. She thought she would not go back and tell that woman anything different. There was nothing different to tell. Outside in the garden, in the April morning, the rosemary that had come back from 3 years of being left for dead moved in the mountain wind. Beside it, small and new and just beginning, the basil put out its second set of leaves, both of them growing in the same ground, both of them exactly where they were supposed to be, not as arrangement, as life. The aspens moved. The valley was very far below. Nora looked at this man who had handed her a sack of provisions and told her to leave, and had not once, in all the weeks since, actually wanted her to go. This man who carried his grief like river stones in his pockets, heavy and smooth and always present. This man who fixed things quietly and set water down without meeting her eyes and had cried without hiding it and said her name like it meant something when he finally said it. "I packed my bag once," she said, the night Doyle's note came. He was very still. "I sat on the edge of the rope bed with the bag in my lap," she said, "and I thought about Philadelphia, about the rented room, about the letter I signed and the trail I climbed and the garden I pulled out of the ground with my bare hands." She looked at him steadily. "And then I unpacked it, because I did not come up this mountain to run from the next hard thing. I came up this mountain to stop running." He let out a breath that was not quite steady. "Stay," he said. It was the simplest word he had ever said to her, and it cost him the most. "Yes," she said. The mountain held them both in its cold, and its gold, and its long patience, and neither of them moved for a moment. And it was enough. It was exactly enough. Spring came late that year, the way it does at altitude, slowly and without apology, arriving in pieces rather than all at once. The snow was still on the north faces of the peaks in April when the garden began in earnest. Not just the rosemary and the herbs that had survived the winter under the stones Cormac had placed along the border. New things. Things Nora had ordered from a seed merchant in Denver in February, sitting at the kitchen table with the catalog and the knowledge of what this soil could hold, writing out the order in her clear, careful hand. She had ordered more than she needed, the way a person orders when they are planning not just for this season, but for the one after, and the one after that. The first morning she saw the new shoots, she stood in the garden for a long time. Cormac came and stood at the fence. "The heirloom basil came up," she said, Which one is that? The one I ordered from the man in Denver, the Italian variety. She touched the small leaves carefully. My grandmother grew it. I haven't seen it since I was a child. He opened the gate and came into the garden. He stood beside her and looked down at the row of small green shoots, unremarkable to look at, carrying everything she had just told him. He reached down and rubbed one leaf gently between his fingers. He held his hand up toward her. She leaned in. The smell of it was particular and sharp and exactly what she remembered. Her grandmother's kitchen, summer afternoons, the specific green smell of something that had traveled a long way through time to be here. "Smells like something new," he said. She looked at him, at his face in the April morning light, less guarded than it had been in September, not unguarded. That was not who he was, and she did not need it to be, but carrying less of the weight that had made him look like a man braced against something. He looked like a man standing in a garden on a spring morning. He looked like a man who had decided to be where he was. "It is," she said. He straightened up and looked out at the full length of the garden, at the rows they had worked together through the fall, and the stones along the borders, and the woody stems of the herbs that had survived the winter and were putting out new growth in the April sun. Claire's heirloom rosemary in its established row, Nora's basil beside it, just beginning, not replacing, not erasing, just the next thing, growing in the same ground. He picked the small sprig of rosemary from the established row and held it out to her. She took it and held it with the balsam leaf, and the two smells together were something she did not have a name for yet, but would, in time. "Come inside," he said. "Coffee's on." She followed him through the garden gate and up the porch steps and through the cabin door. Inside, 2 cups sat on the table, 2 plates, 2 chairs, both of them whole, both of them pulled up to the same table. The spoon he had carved through the winter evenings lay on the kitchen shelf where she had put it the morning he finished it, the wood smooth and warm from being handled. The fire was already going. The lamp was turned low against the morning light coming through the window, through the curtains she had made from flour sacks in the first weeks, soft and faded now, moved by the draft that came in under the door. She sat down. He poured the coffee and sat across from her, the way he had been sitting across from her since the morning she had come back from Greystone with a heavy sack on her shoulders and set it down on the porch, and refused, quietly and completely, to be the kind of woman who could be handed a sack of provisions and persuaded to disappear. The mountain was outside, wild and cold and indifferent in all the ways that mountains are indifferent. The wind still finding the gaps in the cabin walls, the winter still present in the north-facing hollows, the work still there tomorrow and the day after, unglamorous and unending. And inside the cabin, a woman drank her coffee at a table in a room that was hers, in a life that was hers, that she had carried up a mountain on her own back and planted with her own hands and refused to abandon when the ground was hard and the season was against her. She thought about the woman who had stood at the base of that trail in September with $43 and a piece of paper and a carpet bag that was too heavy to carry comfortably, but she had carried it anyway. She thought about all the things that woman had not known yet. The silence, the bucket of cold water, the doll with one eye, the ledger and its lies, and the truth she had found underneath them, the long cold nights and the slowly warming silences, and the specific sound of a man's name when you finally allow yourself to say it, like it means something. She thought, She would not go back and tell that woman anything different. There was nothing different to tell. Outside, she could hear him moving around the garden. The gate had a particular sound when he opened it, a small metallic click she had memorized without meaning to, the way you memorize the sounds of a place that has become yours. She heard his boots on the porch steps. She heard the door. He came in with a few sprigs of fresh rosemary in his hand, pale green and sharp-smelling. He set them on the table beside her coffee cup without comment. She did not comment either. She picked one up and rolled it between her fingers, and the smell of it filled the cabin, clean and specific and alive. This was the thing about a life built slowly, she thought. You did not notice most of the moments as they happened. You noticed them later, assembled into a pattern, the way you notice a path through a field only after you have walked it enough times to wear it into the grass. The bucket of water, the fixed chair, the stones along the garden border, the spoon on the shelf, the sound of her name in a voice that had learned to mean it. None of those things had announced themselves as important when they happened. They had simply accumulated, the way small things do, into something that could hold a person's weight. She set the rosemary down beside her cup and looked at the man across the table from her, at his hands around his coffee, at the quality of his attention when he was comfortable enough to let it rest on something without guarding it. He was looking at the window, at the April light coming through the flour sack curtains. He was not looking at anything in particular. He was simply in the room, present and unhurried, a man who had finally decided that where he was where he intended to be. She had made the same decision. It had not been dramatic when she made it. It had been quiet, the way most of the real decisions in her life had been quiet. A letter sealed and set by the door. A trail climbed with a heavy bag. A burlap sack taken from a stranger's hands and carried through an open door. The mountain was outside, the same mountain it had always been. But she was not the same woman who had stood at its base in September with $43 and a piece of paper and the particular determination of someone who has run out of other options. She was the woman who had stayed. Outside in the garden, in the April morning, the rosemary that had come back from 3 years of being left for dead moved in the mountain wind. Beside it, small and new and just beginning, the basil put out its second set of leaves, both of them growing in the same ground, both of them exactly where they were supposed to be.